grown-ups said it was the wind that made the howls, that it was the water that took my sister. They said wind and water, but all I heard was wolf. I remember the night the police came over after Dawn had vanished, hours after they'd first arrived to hear my mum's explanation, to take the details and the description, leaving with assurances that she couldn't have gotten far and that they would probably come back with her. They returned to the house empty-handed, but they did come with a message. It wasn't one they said out loud or that they even needed to explain. I read it from their faces, from the way that they, the people who were employed to protect us, to be our defense against the bad guys, rushed in through the door as if their very lives depended on it, fleeing not from something they had seen or could identify, but from the sound, the howl, and more likely the shape that noise suggested to their imaginations, to their primal instinct for survival. It gave them, I knew, the image of a predator, and it told them both to run. They stumbled through the front door of our house the way that I would through the living room door when I'd been forced to sprint across the darkened hallway, convinced that some creature would be snapping at my heels. Hundreds of times I would run through a small patch of dark, convinced that as soon as I stepped out of light, 1,000 taloned hands would reach for me. I was so convinced that I would try to clear that space in as few steps and as quickly as possible, bounding across that small stretch and barreling through the door to safety. When I got to the light, to the safety and warmth of the living room where my family would be seated, entirely unaware, I would rush inside and then pretend. With my heart still beating heavily in my throat, I would try to casually walk to the armchair and sit down as if nothing had happened. I gave no clue that I was scared and acted for all the world as if I had not, moments ago, imagined or felt something close behind me. My parents would never have suspected it, but Dawn knew. She knew because she had done the same frightened sprint many times herself. I knew the look on the officer's face because it was one I had worn myself, a mask that said, "Everything is okay, I'm not afraid of the dark." But of course I was, and so were they, climbing the stairs as instructed, up to my room. I called goodnight back to my parents and wandered into my room. For a long time I sat, motionless on the edge of my bed. I'd like to say that I was thinking. I was contemplating what my next move should be, but that would be a lie. I wasn't thinking or considering anything. I already knew what I needed to do. I sat for a long time, not because I needed time to think, but because it took me that long to work up the courage. With the police still speaking and my mother still sobbing downstairs, all of them thinking that I was safely tucked up in bed, I instead forced open the window of my room and listened. The howl came again, and I made my decision. For many years up to that point, I had hated the tree outside my window, the way that the light behind it made the branches look like hands that would crawl and spread across my bedroom wall. The way that on certain nights, through the cracks in the curtains, I would glimpse the twists and knots in its bark and see in place of the wooden surface, faces with bulging eyes and wide screaming mouths. Tonight though, for the very first time, that tree was an ally, a friend that would help me get where I needed to go. Quietly opening the cupboard, I gently fished around inside for the hiking boots I knew were at the back. My coat was downstairs out of reach, but I knew that I had jumpers somewhere in the drawers. Bundling myself up in this hastily assembled outfit, I deliberately coughed, loudly enough to mask the sound of my window sliding upwards and open, then swinging one leg out over the sill and onto the thick cross branch close to the house, I eased myself out of my room and onto the tree itself. The thick fog had made the surface of the tree moist and somewhat slippery, whilst the high winds did nothing to help my balance, but with careful placement of the hands and feet, I was able to climb down from the tree and pout into the garden, careful to squat behind it and not be seen by the police or any nosy passers-by who might catch a glimpse of me. As it was, there was very little chance of that. The lack of lights, coupled with the sound, meant that people had chosen not to stray outside. Instead, they huddled inside, locking and double-locking their doors, lighting candles and old oil lamps and trying as best as they could to distract themselves from what they could hear outside. For me, already standing outside, that howl seemed to hang like the fog itself heavily over the town. It seemed like some awful threatening blanket to envelop the place, weighing it down and suggesting with every new call that it was somehow closer no matter where you happened to be. I won't lie and say that I was unaffected by the sounds. that I was somehow brave and immune to the fear that had clearly already touched the hearts of the police officers with its icy talons. I was not brave, but I was desperate. Desperate to know, to find Dawn, and if possible to save her, because if the thing making those noises was what I thought it was, then time was running out and it may already be too late. So it was that with infinite care I crept around the side of the house and retrieved the battery-powered lamp from the front of my father's bike. It wasn't quite a torch, but it did cut effectively through the darkness and the fog, at least enough for me to be able to find my way out of the garden, through the back entry and along the road toward the Carswell Wood. Approaching those woods, I felt as if I was the only person alive. The world, it seemed, was entirely deserted, a land in which the usual colour had been drained away, replaced by a thick grey murk, punctuated at intervals by small hazy balls of yellowish light, where a candle or lamp was trying in vain to carve out a path and light the way ahead. Had the moon above not been blazed full and pearly white, it might have been impossible for me to find my way. Aside from the howls which came every few minutes, the entire place was silent. It's strange to say, but that kind of quiet makes everything else loud. The sound of your breath, the heartbeat, thudding rhythmically and furiously in your chest, the clop and clack of your heels on the cobblestones, every little movement has an exaggerated noise, a sound that the silence takes and consumes. I decided upon reaching the black iron gates that marked the entrance to the wood, that I would try to retrace Dawn's steps, that I would work my way along the path through the trees and toward Jenny's house. I would nip off the marked path around halfway up, taking the shortcut I knew that Dawn would have taken on her way home, the path from which she would have gone missing where the trees and bushes were thicker. I would trace her steps all the way to Jenny's door, and then I stopped dead. Looking down at the thick gouts of dirt and mud below, at the tree to my left and the path to my right, I knew already that there would be no need to go all the way to Jenny's. Here was the entire story, laid out for all to see. There were 3 sets of prints. The police, I assumed instantly, would not have come down here. They would have taken the main path, unaware of this shortcut through the thicket and sticking to their theory, would have walked down to the river, looking for evidence that Dawn might have fallen in. These prints told a different story. One set, I knew immediately, were Dawn's. They were coming from the direction of Jenny's house along the path. They were small, like a young girl's foot size, and close together, showing the stride was not long and the person who made the prints was not so tall. The second set of prints were made by much larger feet, wrapped in heavy work boots that made deep indentations. These prints had wide spaces between but were scuffed and deeper at the front, the heel not even visible. What this showed was that whoever had made them had stepped very heavily at the front of the foot. They were running. Had I seen only those prints, I would not have formed a story already. The prints of a little girl and the prints of a man, clearly running. You could, if you observed where the prints overlapped, see the story of a man coming into the woods after the girl. Still, the man's prints came from the direction I had just taken, veering off the path toward this point. It was not as if this person had been waiting on the shortcut path. The pattern of sprinting also started straight away, so by the time they arrived on the shortcut, they were already running. This guy, I reasoned, had run off the path and towards Dawn, who was coming from the other direction. He would not have been able to see Dawn from the main path, and even if he had bad intentions, he would not have known she was there unless he had heard her. It was this idea of him hearing Dawn that made more sense. This guy, I thought, heard her when she screamed. Why would a man suddenly run off the path and into a thicket because he had heard a young girl scream? This guy was a would-be rescuer. The question of what he was rescuing her from was answered by the third set of prints. I followed them, my throat tightening as I watched them stretch across the path and out into the thicket. I allowed the beam of the bike lamp to follow each print, pursuing the trail made by this thing, until at the very edge of the shortcut path, where the branches of trees grew thicker, the beam of the lamp came to settle not upon a footprint, but instead upon a foot.